Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, we will be taking a look at the 2022 Senate elections as of today, and where the polls stand as of today. This is not my actual prediction, this is not what I think is going to happen, where these races are. This is where the polls think the races are, and that's what the topic of today's video is. So please don't be one of those people that comments, what a biased, terrible prediction, slanders me for no reason, and just overall doesn't take 2 seconds out of their life to read the title of the video. So please don't be that person. But yeah, we're just going to get right into it. So I'll be looking at the 538 polls. RCP is better than 538 in my opinion, because they generally adjust for Republican undersampling better than 538 does. So I use RCP in October, November during crunch time, but right now, if RCP is, kind of gets off a little later than 538 does, so they don't really have averages too much as 538 does at least, so we'll be using 538. 538 also updates their website more often, so we'll be using that. And in addition to that, I will be using the 538 averages. If there's not an average, I will just calculate it quickly, but 538 should have averages for most of these races, so yeah, we'll get into it right now. The first state we'll be doing is Washington. We'll be going in geographical order. And so in Washington, the Democratic incumbent here is Patty Murray, running against Republican Tiffany Smiley, who's a fairly good candidate. She's, I think, doing the best you can do as a Republican in Washington. But what we're seeing here is that originally the polls showed a tight race. Tiffany Smiley's internal only had her down by 5 points, and these other polls had Murray within single digits or only up by 11. But since then, we've seen some pretty good polls for Patty Murray, and ultimately what we're seeing is that Murray would ultimately be up by more than 15% once you average out these polls and adjust for the fact that the best Tiffany Smiley poll was a Republican internal. Next up is Nevada. Nevada is really interesting because in the past the polls have underestimated Democrats, but in 2020 they overestimated Democrats for the first time. So we don't really know who they're going to break this time, but they do show a close race with Catherine Cortez Masto up by about 1.5 points, which is currently what I personally would expect the race to end up looking like ultimately. But yeah, so we've seen some pretty interesting polls here. The most recent poll came from Beacon Research, which is a more Democratic-leaning pollster. They only sampled 300 voters, so it's not a great poll. But they showed Catherine Cortez Masto at 51%, which, again, is a very good showing this far out. Because if you're 51%, you can afford to lose all the undecideds and still win the election. So if Cortez Masto's at 51% in the polls on Election Day, she'll probably be a favorite. But as of right now, we don't really know. And, these other polls have had her up too. We saw one Republican internal poll, McLaughlin Associates, which is a very conservative poll, showing that Laxalt was up by 1 point. But the fact that Laxalt was only up by 1 point in his own poll is not great. And then we saw on the flip side more Democratic-leaning pollsters showing a decently close race, Cortez Masto only being up by 3. And, these other polls where she was up by 20 points, which is completely crazy. But yeah, so if you believe 538's aggregate, Cortez Masto's up by about 1.5 points, which falls into the lean or into the tilt category, which is what I have. So the polls and I agree in Nevada. Next up is Arizona. And Arizona is a race to watch because the polls have just been incredible for Democrats here. In every single poll, Mark Kelly has a comfortable lead. And really, we've seen poll after poll, no matter if it's against Brnovich, Lamon, or Blake Masters, that Kelly is holding strong here, really. The poll that we saw with him against Blake Masters had him up by 12. This one had him up by 15. This one had him up by 9. And, I don't know. I hope that it doesn't have a little chart thingy. But, I mean, really, like, if you believe the polls, Kelly's up by a likely margin, which I know is crazy to say. But, again, the polls in Arizona do tend to overestimate Democrats. So it isn't game over for Blake Masters just yet. But that is what the polls say. So Utah is up next. Utah is interesting because there's an independent, Evan McMullen, running there. And the Democrats didn't really put up a candidate, so it'll be McMullen versus Mike Lee, the Republican incumbent. And in Utah, we haven't really seen a ton of polls here, but they do actually. Oh, actually, we have seen a ton of. In fairness, wait, I didn't know we had this many. Well, okay, so actually, we have seen a ton of polls that I just didn't know existed apparently. And a few that actually have McMullen ahead, but the average in 538 is about a 9.5 point lead for Mike Lee. Although notably, he's not at 50%, so this race would still technically be in play. But yeah, that not great for the Republicans that they're in single digits in Utah. But again, Evan McMullen is probably the best chance the Democrats have at flipping the seat. And again, he's not really a Democrat. He's kind of this moderate conservative who would still probably vote with the Republicans. But again, if Mike Lee were to lose his election here to Evan McMullen, it would be really interesting for the Republicans because they'd be in a bit of a sticky situation here. But yeah, probably not going to happen anyways. Colorado is up next. Colorado, we have Michael Bennett facing Joe O'Dea, who's a fairly strong challenger in his own right. But again, it's Colorado. It's a fairly blue state. Whoops, I don't want California, I want Colorado. And we've seen really good polls for Bennett against O'Dea. He was up by 13. In this poll, he was up. This is actually the only poll we have against O'Dea, but he was leading Ron Hanks as well, who was O'Dea's primary challenger. But yeah, if you believe the polls here, the Democrats are up by 13, which is a likely margin. It's kind of weird to see Arizona and Colorado being the same shade of blue because Matt Kelly's up by double digits, and as is Michael Bennett, as you'd expect. But I do want to briefly note that Colorado is the only state in 2020 where the polls actually underestimated Democrats. They had Biden winning by I think 2% less than he actually won by. And so the polls in Colorado are probably be pretty good this year. Missouri is up next. So Missouri is interesting because you don't know who's going to win the GOP nomination. I think Billy Long is the narrow favorite as of right now. But again, we don't know, quite frankly, and we don't have a nominee. So they don't actually have that much Billy Long polling either. But what we've seen is that Eric Greitens is definitely the worst nominee for the Republicans. He was, I guess in this poll he was, Vicky Hartz was only up by a point, Greitens up by 5. But I think the consensus is that Greitens is the worst nominee for the GOP. But the polls have been all over the place. They've kind of been drifting between narrow GOP leads and bigger GOP leads. But again, I think if you average these polls out, I don't know the exact number you get, but you'd probably get a number, 7 or 8%, which is in the likely category. Again, the Republicans are going to win Missouri no matter what, even if Greitens is the nominee. But the thing with Missouri is that if the Republicans only end up winning Missouri by 7 or 8, it'll mean that they'll have to invest in it a little bit. And a 7 or 8 point win in Missouri doesn't correspond well to the rest of the country if you're a Republican. So that's not great for them. But again, it's just the polls, what they say. Now, Iowa's interesting because originally I think most people had this race written off as safe Republican. But what we're seeing is that this race is a little more competitive than people think. Mike Franken did 2 internal polls, and he was up or down by 3 in this one, down by 5 in this one. And then Selzer, which is the best pollster for Iowa, and they're the gold standard, really. Whatever Selzer says usually is right. They had Grassley only up by 8 points. So if you believe the polls, Michael Franken is within striking distance of Chuck Grassley, and I don't really think it's going to happen. But the polls show a pretty narrow race right now. The fact that Selzer, which is it has a bit of a Republican tilt, but again, they're still very good. I really trust them in Iowa. Only showing Grassley up by 8% is very, very interesting. Now, Illinois is next. Illinois is interesting because we don't have that many Senate polls. We have a few governor polls between J.B. Pritzker and Bailey, but the only poll we've seen here with Tammy Duckworth, she's up by 9%. So that isn't great for her. Again, it's kind of like the reverse Missouri, that the Democrats are going to win it no matter what. But again, only being up by 9% or single digits isn't great in a state as partisan as Illinois or Missouri. Wisconsin is to me, Wisconsin's just a joke because the polls there are so bad. They had Clinton up by 6%, they had Biden up by 8%, and ultimately they were very wrong. So the polls right now, again, I don't know if you guys know, but Nelson, Lasry, and Godlewski all dropped out, and now it's essentially just Mandela Barnes as the de facto nominee. And Barnes is up by 2 in this poll over Ron Johnson, which is just a complete joke. But again, since this is the only Johnson versus Barnes poll we have, I'm going to label it as lean Democratic, which again, I don't think is accurate. I think Ron Johnson's going to win re-election by 7% or something like that. But again, the only poll we have with him against Mandela Barnes has him down by 2. But again, it's Wisconsin. Take Wisconsin polls with a grain of salt. Now, the polls in Ohio are just similar to Wisconsin. I don't know what to think of them because they are a complete they're divorced from reality, quite frankly. Because right now, Tim Ryan's up by over 2% over J.D. Vance. And look, I know that J.D. Vance is not running that good of a campaign. I know that the Republicans are getting worried about this race. Things are getting harder for them. But ultimately, the fact that every single poll, even this Republican-leaning pollster, is showing Tim Ryan ahead just to me doesn't make any sense. It's Ohio. It's a right-trending state. It's a Trump plus 8 state. It's not going to flip in a Biden midterm. If Ohio flips, I don't even know what I'll do, but I'll do something ridiculous on a live stream or something. But there is no way that this race is flipping, and the fact that polls showed Tim Ryan up by more than 2% just to me is just corroborates the fact that the polls in Ohio are just awful. In 2020, they showed Biden up by a point. He lost it by 8. They showed Hillary Clinton within striking distance of Trump in 2016. She lost it by 8%, and they showed Richard Cordray beating Mike DeWine, and the polls in Ohio are just always overestimating Democrats, and I don't think they're fixed. This like I believe they were fixed if they show J.D. Vance solidly ahead, but they aren't because they show Tim Ryan ahead. When Tim Ryan, it'll be nearly impossible for him to win. So Florida's up next. Florida's just we've had so many different polls here in Florida, and they've all they've shown mixed things. So we've seen a lot of good polls from Marco Rubio. This Rubio plus 10 poll, Rubio plus 5 poll, Rubio plus 8 poll, but we also saw from Phillips Academy Demings up by 2, and then we saw another I think crazy poll where that's the governor's race, but yeah. The polls in Florida, we've had a lot of fluctuation here, but these average out to probably like Rubio by 8 or 9 or something like that. So it's it's likely. I think the polls in Florida they're all really bad, but they cancel each other out and get to a decent margin. So yeah, Georgia, the polls have really just had a ton of momentum for Raphael Warnock. I mean, he is up by 3%, and he was down for most of the time, but now he's up, and that is really good for him because, again, the polls in Georgia are actually quite good in 2020. They weren't amazing. They still overestimated the Democrats by a little bit because I think they had Biden up by 2 or 3, and he only won by, as we know, like 0.24%. But in the runoffs, they were pretty good. And in 2021, the polls in California actually underestimated the Democrats, which is an interesting thing. In Virginia, they were very good. They had Youngkin up by 2. He won by 2. So, I think the polls in Georgia aren't hopeless, and that's why I think that Herschel Walker is actually favored to lose this race. But, being down 3% is never good. And, the fact that in these even GOP-leading pollsters, like this Bolton Pack, he's only up by 5. And these other GOP-leading pollsters, he's down, or he's even in this. In his own poll, he's even, right? So these other polls have just been really, really bad for Herschel Walker, and in the better polls like Fox and Survey USA and data for not data for Florida, sorry, Quinnipiac, he's down 10, he's down by 9, he's down by 4. So just not a good showing for Herschel Walker right now. I think a lot of Republicans are really worried about their chances with him, and ultimately not great for them in Georgia. North Carolina is another one that's really interesting to me. I think that, to me, North Carolina, I don't really know whether it's lean Republican or likely Republican, but the polls have shown a very tight race in North Carolina. And so the average here, oh my God, I can't find it, but the average here is Ted Budd up by a point. But it's been closing. He was up by 6% back in May and June, and now he's only up by a point. And we've seen there was some decent polls for Sherry Beasley. She was up by 2% in this Bolton, this Super PAC, which is, again, a Republican poll. And in Trafalgar's poll, which is a very Republican-leaning pollster. Again, they had Trump winning the 2020 election. They had him winning Michigan and Pennsylvania and Nevada. She's only down by 3. So again, in a lot of these Republican polls, the race has been very, very close. But again, Ted Budd still has a narrow advantage. And again, the polls in North Carolina do tend to underestimate the Republican support. So North Carolina, very narrow race there, close we've seen so far, but a narrow Republican lead. In Pennsylvania, we've seen just a disastrous slate of polls for Dr. Oz. John Fetterman seems to be taking a commanding lead with these numbers, and it's just really getting really bad for John Fetterman, or for Dr. Oz. John Fetterman, right now, in most recent polls, he's been up by 9%, up by 6%, up by 4%, up by 13%, up by 11%, up by 9%, up by 6%, and up by 11% again. And so if you average all these polls, they're probably going to get to a maybe 8, 9, 10% margin of victory for John Fetterman, which again, I don't believe. A lot of you guys, think I'm too harsh on Fetterman, that I'm, kind of a doomer on Fetterman if you're a Democrat, or that I'm, just against him for whatever reason. But really, I don't believe the Pennsylvania polls for a second. In 2020 on 538 in their aggregate, Biden was up by way more than he ended up winning the state by. And in the 2016 Senate polls, if you go back to the summer 2016, back in August 2016, Katie McGinty was beating Pat Toomey by a couple points in those polls. So, Dr. Oz has had a really low point in his campaign. It's never good when you're down this much in the polls, but again, we don't want to jump to conclusions too early. So the last day we'll be doing is New Hampshire here. Again, New Hampshire, we don't have we have a fair bit of polling, but we've seen some interesting numbers here. In most of these polls, Maggie Hassan is ahead. The most recent poll against Dawn Bolduc had her up by 4. She was leading this, I don't even know who Smith is, by 4, and she's leading Chuck Morris by 3. It's probably going to be either Bolduc or Morris. If I had to guess, Bolduc will be the nominee, but Maggie Hassan leading him by 4, by 9, by 1, and by 15 and 5. So that averages out to probably, I don't know, a 6-7 point lead for Maggie Hassan, somewhere in that likely category. But again, very strong showings for the Democrats, both in New Hampshire and nationwide. Like if you look at these polls, they're competitive in red states like Utah, Missouri, and Iowa. They are winning red states like Ohio. They're flipping Wisconsin, flipping Pennsylvania easily. They are essentially in a toss-up race in North Carolina, and they're holding on to Arizona and Georgia fairly well in addition to that. So the polls right now seem to indicate a blue wave year, which is interesting because the consensus is that at the very least the Republicans are going to do quite well this year. And so I just think the polls are, the polls and the Biden approval tell a really different story. The polls will lead, the state polls would lead you to believe that the Democrats are in for a very good evening, that they're going to pick up 3 Senate seats and, maybe win the House again. Whereas these Biden approval polls, Biden's at he has a 38% approval rating. Biden has a disastrous approval rating as of right now. It's awful. He's actually gone up a little bit. Good for him. He's now at 39%. Good job, Joe. You're now a little less terribly unpopular than you were a week ago. So Biden's gone up in approval, which is interesting. But 39% approval is still very bad. That should go without saying. But we're seeing two different worlds. The Biden approval numbers suggest a red wave. The economy's not great. People are really dissatisfied. But then we see, on the other hand, these state polls showing that the Democratic Party is on pace to flip 3 Senate seats here, which would be an incredible result for them. So that's just what the polls say. This is my actual prediction as of right now. Again, it's only the summer. In the summer, the polls tend to skew towards the Democrats, whereas they narrow up a little bit in the fall. But yeah, this is what the polls say as of right now. So what do you think? Do you think the Democrats are going to flip Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania? Do you think they're going to hold on to Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia, and New Hampshire? Do you think they're in striking distance of Ted Budd in North Carolina? We don't know. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Tell me what you think of this video. Comment down sections below as always. And I'll see you all next video. Bye, guys.